Welcome to the Latin American Perspectives podcast. My name is Alex Scott. I am your host, and I'm recording this podcast for you from my apartment in Fullerton, California. For today's episode, I met with LAP editors Janet Conway and Natalie LeBon to discuss their July 2021 issue of LAP titled Popular Feminisms, Pasts, Presents, and Futures. Janet Conway currently holds the Nancy Rowell Jackman Chair in Women's Studies at Mount St. Vincent University. She is also a full professor of sociology at Brock University and former Canada Research Chair in Social Justice. Natalie LeBon is an anthropologist and teaches women's gender and sexuality studies at Gettysburg College. She is co-editor with Elizabeth Mayer of Women's Activism in Latin America and the Caribbean, Engendering Social Justice, Democratizing Citizenship, that was published by Rutgers University Press in 2010. She is also the author of De lo Privado a lo Público, 30 años de lucha ciudadana de las mujeres en América Latina, published by Siglo XXI in 2006. Now, let's get to the interview. Oh, awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for meeting with me. I'm really appreciative for you both being flexible and willing to do this right now.
I appreciate your careful and insightful questions.
Oh, okay. Great.
Yeah, no, I thought, wow, he gets it.
Yeah, I do. I love it. I really like the issue. It's fantastic. I'm really excited to read more of the essays because I've only been able to read the introduction, but especially both of your contributions sound really interesting. We've never had either of you on as guests, so this is pretty exciting. Now, could you provide our listeners with a brief overview of the issue and how it came about?
Well, I'll say something quickly about my own involvement with these questions, and then Natalie, I'm sure I will have other things to say, but I first encountered something called popular feminism in Peru in the 1980s. And it was my first trip to Latin America, and I encountered this form of grassroots feminism among really poor women living in urban shanty towns and being supported by, at that time, church workers. And when I went on to read and learn more about this phenomenon of popular feminism, I just came to be aware that this was a larger phenomenon on the continent. But then it kind of dropped out of sight analytically and substantively. And in the course of my studies then, over the last 20 years of the World March of Women, it reappeared. And it actually reappeared as I and colleagues were trying to make sense of the feminism of the march in a Latin American context. But also, and here I just want to hand the bouquet over to Natalie to say that it was her naming of the activism of the World March of Women in Brazil as a form of popular feminism that made the connection for me. And it led to our conversations and our taking on this initiative.
Yeah, and for me, it also started with working with, in the 1990s, with groups of women in São Paulo, in the urban periphery of São Paulo, which similarly to what Janet describes, they were also connected to churches at the time, but not all of them. And I was doing this, so I have this kind of longer view. I'm an anthropologist, so I have this one little corner where I keep going. I go back and I go back and I go back. And these organizations over time started, in the 2000s, started being connected to the march. And in fact, were the World March of Women, and in fact, have played a really important role in it since Brazil was hosting the international committee, or the international secretariat actually, of the march for 7 years. So, and as Janet mentioned, I noticed that popular feminism was the label that the activists of the march were using. I didn't come up with it. I just listened to what they were saying, and that's what they were using. So I was at the time thinking of something more like along the line of social justice feminism or something along those lines, and they used popular feminism. And I was like, okay. Again, working with the World March of Women was sort of like, for me, the continuation of what was, and so therefore of popular feminism more generally.
Mm-hmm. And I think our intellectual questions about popular feminism had to do with, on one hand, the fact that we knew this prehistory from the 1980s, but the seeming disappearance of the term in feminist scholarship through the 90s, and then its reappearance in a big feminist initiative like the World March of Women in the 2000s. So that was a kind of intellectual question. And then secondly was our own knowledge, again, of the proliferation of various kinds of grassroots feminisms and the prominence of discourses around race and indigeneity that didn't seem to articulate to that category of popular feminism. And so it posed a question to us, about the salience of that genealogy of popular feminism and the salience of naming these practices in this way, or whether in fact it obscured some specificities that had appeared since the 1990s. So that sort of set our intellectual agenda for the issue. And we brought the project to Latin American perspectives because of the explicit kind of anti-capitalist politics that were associated with the historical discourse of popular feminism. And we saw that in the World March of Women, and we wanted to ask questions about the relationship to the left, historically and currently, and also ask the questions about the relationship of the left character of popular feminism in terms of its seeming effacement of race and indigeneity. So these were the kinds of questions that we were asking, and we thought Latin American Perspectives was a good site for that conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think Latin American Perspectives is a good site for that conversation. And I'm very glad that you ended up submitting your proposal to the journal. I feel like it's a perfect fit with all those topics. Now, before we get too far ahead, because some of our listeners might not be familiar with the popular feminist movement or popular feminism in general. I know I wasn't as aware until I read your introduction to the issue. So could you discuss specifically what constitutes popular feminism as a political and social movement? And could you provide some background information on the history of the movement? Some questions that I think are particularly interesting is how this type of feminism, these feminist movements, and approach to gender politics in general, how does this differ from other forms of feminism or other grassroots women's movements that we've seen across Latin America for some time?
So this notion of popular feminism is very broad, right? It's used in a lot of different ways. And so we try to, and I think here I give the bouquet to Janet, so to really sort of tease out the fact that there's two ways that popular feminism is used as a label. One of them is to just talk about very generally about, and that's by observers, I have to say, more than the sort of the political label that people may use for themselves. So observers would look at organizations organizing by women from the popular sectors, popular understood in the Latin American sense, or Latin Americanist sense, not the North American sense. So women from the popular sectors organizing for better well-being for their communities that include, in some cases more than others, attention to gender equality or gender equity, right? So that's one way that the term is used. And the other way is generally more self-identified and for groups that are very much more politicized, connected to the broader left, and really want to foreground a gender class perspective or a gender class framework to their politics. So that's sort of like the two main categories. Mm-hmm. So trying to figure out, where these things fit.
Yeah, I would just say that very concretely that historically the term popular feminism overlapped a lot with the Movimiento de Mujeres. So that notion of women who did not self-identify as feminists, who maybe had never heard of feminism, but were self-organizing or organizing with the help of other agents and organizations in poor neighborhoods, in very poor subalternized neighborhoods, on very concrete things like organizing for water, organizing for milk programs, around popular kitchens, for better housing, for urban services. I mean, very, very concrete material, if I can use that term, material needs of their families and their communities. And they were organizing as women very largely because they were mothers. So this is another feature of popular feminism, is that it is grounded in this kind of gendered agency of women who are in traditional gendered divisions of labor, and don't problematize that necessarily, and certainly not initially. So it's women mobilizing as mothers to protect their children from violence, to feed them, to improve the lives of their families and their neighborhoods. And as those practices came into contact with more self-identified forms of feminism, those women also began to become aware of themselves as women and as kind of the gendered character of their situations. And in some cases, they made a claim on the feminist movement, claiming that they themselves were feminists, but their form of feminism was historically, and in many cases remains, in considerable tension with more middle and upper class forms of feminism. And it has to do with that, number one, the valorization of traditional gender divisions of labor, the valorization of motherhood, maternity, heteronormative forms of, women's work and women's agency and women's lives, and also an insistence on, or an ambivalence perhaps, toward the traditional feminist agenda, which very centered on sexual autonomy, bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, abortion rights, and then advancing women in the professions and access to education and so on. And though that kind of feminist agenda was not really a priority for these really poor women, and it was the tensions around those agendas and their implications for the politics of a feminist movement that led to a lot of tensions historically. And these tensions still exist among feminisms, even though, well, I mean, that's probably, can't really generalize, but there's clearly, these poor women's movements, the more they get articulated to well-organized entities like Via Campesina, the World March of Women, CONTAGE, movements that are recognized as important politically and on the left, then there comes to be some greater capacity to have that kind of dialogue across feminisms as well.
Thank you for bringing up those points. And I think we're going to come back to a number of things you just touched upon. Now, another central line of inquiry in the issue is this issue of the conditions of the possibility for popular feminist subjectivities among subalternized women. I'd love to hear you embellish on this important point. I'm really intrigued by that idea of popular feminist subjectivities among subalternized women.
Well, I think one of the questions we asked our contributors to address and to be very self-conscious about was, in the practices they were documenting and studying, who or what were the forms of collective organization that were present, and how did they articulate to these gendered practices? And because we wanted to be tuned in to that, to what were the actual political and social and economic conditions of possibility for this kind of popular feminist subjectivity to take shape. And as readers will see in the issue, that, certainly the Liberation Church historically was really important. Socialist feminist activists were really important, like individuals or small groups who went into poor communities and organized in those communities were really important. Subsequently, small-scale feminist NGOs and community-based organizations were also really important. The contributions to the issue also talk about, for example, an official discourse of popular feminism in the Bolivarian Project in Venezuela. So that facilitated a whole form of popular feminist politics in Venezuela. The Zapatistas were also very instrumental in a certain, I mean, again, there's this constant kind of interplay or dialectic between the emerging critical self-consciousness of poor women with each other, but also interacting with kind of available discourses and ways of understanding their reality that are materialized in their communities through these organizations, right? So I don't know, Natalie, what else you would say?
Yeah. Right. I think, as you're talking, I'm thinking about how that played out in, my little corner of the world. And it was very much self-organizing by these women in poor neighborhoods and in connecting with, in this particular case, Siempre Viva Organización Feminista, which was, is a very important group for the World March now, but in those days was helping to organize women in those suburbs and suburbs, if we want to call them that, in the periphery. But so yeah, and again, the church, yeah, in those days at the beginning played a role. Obviously, later on, it led to some friction because they were not as the women got to make the feminist label their own, not for all of them, but some of them, and became more attentive to reproductive rights issues and reproductive justice issues. Clearly, that created some tensions with the church, but that was an important mobilizing factor at the beginning. So I think, or other organizations are important to pay attention to.
I mean, an interesting thread that runs through the issue, I think, and feminist scholars will recognize this, is that feminist subjectivities can be cultivated and are being cultivated in mixed gender social justice movements, right? But when women come into their own within those mixed gender movements, they make demands. And those demands create tension and conflict within those movements. And they make demands around, as Natalie was saying, around sexual and reproductive questions against male violence against women, but also they make demands to have greater voice and greater representation, and they challenge entrenched forms of male power and privilege. And this, is a source of tension in mixed gender movements. But nevertheless, those mixed gender movements are important sites for popular feminism and for women coming into their own, and also for advancing the struggles that they are committed to in terms of well-being for their families and their communities.
Thank you for those very insightful responses. Yeah, I'm a social movement scholar who does research on social movements and contradictory common sense and mobilization and praxis. So I just find that like a really awesome and interesting topic that I look forward to reading more about in your issue. Now, you've already touched upon this, but you make note how studying the World March for Women was really central to orienting the agenda of this issue. And I had heard of the World March for Women before, but I found your introduction really, really insightful, and I want to learn more about it. So could you provide our listeners just with some background information on the march and its significance in shaping the socio-political field of social movements in Latin America?
I guess I can start here. So the World March of Women is a trans-local socialist feminist network of organizations around the world. As some observers say, this might be actually the only one that's truly transnational, and that's present in, at this point, about 60 countries. Although it's not always, each chapter is not necessarily connected to a country. For example, in Spain, you have several chapters, one connected to the Catalan region, so it's not necessarily, there's not a direct connection with each country. But it was born in Canada originally in 1995, and so I'm sure Janet can correct me on some of the details there. But it started there, and by the year 2000, the Canadian groups, the French Canadian groups, I have to say, were trying to make it global and made connections with people mostly in Western Europe and in Latin America. Interestingly, there's this kind of really interesting French-Canadian, Brazilian connection in particular that I've been intrigued about. But that started growing from that perspective. And the key themes that they've been interested in have been certainly it's an anti-capitalist and certainly feminist explicitly feminist organizations at the beginning that focuses on working against poverty and against violence against women. These were like the first two things that they really focused on. Since then, it has really grown to be very attentive to issues of rurality, and as well as it's not limited to urban environments, which I think for us, people who study social movements, the urban environments say, but it's very clearly sort of focused on all of these, and it has representation throughout the world, even though it's very strong in Latin America. So this is sort of like the background. Maybe Janet can take it.
I guess the other thing I would say in terms of your question about how it has shaped the socio-political field is that when the march was in formation in Quebec, and then where they were organizing, transnationally, their intention was really to intervene as feminists on the terrain of the anti-globalization movement. So from the get-go, they were a self-identified, self-organized, mass feminist movement that was explicitly articulated to and committed to this larger mixed gender movement around the world against neoliberal globalization. So in Latin America, that orientation is really strong. So articulation to mass movements of the left, explicit commitment to an anti-capitalist societal project at different scales in the region, but also at the regional level. And they were, in terms of the other feminisms on the ground, the World March really distinguished itself by its critique of the forms of NGOization and institutionalization that many forms of feminism had prioritized in the 1990s. And so the feminists of the World March had sort of never abandoned their socialist feminist orientations, even though socialism kind of fell off the cliff, right? And they were critical of the ways in which they saw a lot of feminist politics being domesticated by the politics of human rights and statist machineries and the UN. And so they really set out to stake out an alternative feminist politic that was articulated to mass movements on the left. And they are also, so that's, I would say, they're kind of macro politic, but then they also have maintained this anchorage in very grassroots women's movements, women's groups. And so they have a kind of territorial politics, right? They seek to build capacity to mobilize street presence on the ground in different parts of the world. So they are doing policy stuff, yes. They are interacting with states, yes. But their real praxis of social transformation has to do with that kind of grassroots self-organizing and mobilizing, and the articulation to other mass movements, mixed gender movements. And just one final thing I'd say about the march in terms of its praxis of popular feminism is that, and certainly Carmen Diaz-Alba talks about this in her piece, the praxis of popular education is super important to the popular feminist praxis of the march. And by that, we mean that this notion that there is a constant kind of interchange happening between the experience of subalternized women and more explicit kinds of feminist discourses and analytics. And that happens through feminist popular education or what they call political training. So there's that kind of very explicit politicization that's underway that I would say, and all our contributors talking about the march, I think would agree that this is really core part of the popular feminism of the march as the march understands popular feminism.
Wow, I find that incredibly uplifting and beautiful, that critical praxis based in a deep and important theoretical and material critique of global capitalism, of liberal feminism, of the liberal feminist commodification of the feminist movement, right? But that critique coupled with real action and a real public praxis of popular education, man, I just find that really encouraging. And I get very excited even hearing you talk about that. So I'm definitely going to look up for more information about this and share information with our listeners in the show notes about this march. I think if you aren't aware of this, everybody who is mildly interested in Latin America and feminism needs to look this up because this just sounds awesome.
Just as an aside, we love the World March. Mm-hmm. We have been super committed to producing knowledge about the march in a way that is, we hope, deeply respectful of their praxis, at the same time as we've tried to ask hard questions. And that is, just by the way, created significant tension for us. But we want to also hand a big bouquet to the activists of the World March of Women, because they have so shaped our sense of the feminist field and the kinds of feminism that we think is really important for the future.
Absolutely. I appreciate you acknowledging that. Now, with all that being said, Despite the progress and important contributions that you highlight that popular feminism has brought, you also acknowledge that, like all other variants of left politics in Latin America and just Latin American society in general, maybe global society, popular feminism has been unfortunately characterized by race blindness persistently, or color blindness. Now, can you share some thoughts on what the various roots of this issue might be, as well as highlighting the need for racializing and decolonizing popular feminism?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess I can start on this. So working in Brazil, and this is a reality that's very much that we encounter throughout Latin America. There has been, historically, a very strong denial of the African roots and indigenous roots. But I work in Brazil, so it's mostly African roots of these societies, even though, in Brazil, more than half of the population is of African descent. In Peru or in Colombia or Bolivia, you have extremely large percentages of people of indigenous descent, right? But the way national racial formations were shaped or have been shaped in Latin America has been around this idea of mestizo or mestiza nations, and in the case of Brazil, the myth of racial democracy, right? And we now know, and even in Brazil now at this point, the PT, the Workers' Party, made it part of their platforms to make sure they were undermining some of these ideas around the myth of racial democracy. But nonetheless, there's still a lot of that present. So I think that parties on the left, feminist organizations, no one is immune to any of this, right? And so I think that's the bedrock of where this race blindness that has until very recently very much, and I want to put that caveat in because, since in the past 3 years after the death of Maria Franco, the assassination of Maria Franco, really there's been, quite a bit of a consciousness aware of an awakening around making sure for popular feminists and other feminist groups to include racial inequalities or racial hierarchies much more clearly in their politics. But I think that, that bedrock of the national formation, racial formation, which is very much race blind, right? So, and then you have, on top of that, you have the fact that left politics have always been centered around the class, right? And the class is made primary as the key thing that you have to work against. And therefore some folks, and historically it's been difficult to acknowledge that gender hierarchies, that racial hierarchies in a certain way fragment, the populous sectors. And on top of that, so that's true in the left. And then you have, you were referring to liberal feminism, but even if we don't want to say liberal feminism in Latin America, but a hegemonic feminism or feminismo histórico, as it's been known, also clearly was very much started among the elites and therefore had this kind of approach. So, all of these have contributed to the difficulties of the march not just the march, but of popular forms of popular feminisms that self-identify as such. That this is where we have to be so careful about the way we talk about this, because clearly there are other forms of popular feminisms that are very much among racialized women or indigenous women who are also popular feminisms, but they may not call themselves that way, but they're also, that's important to recognize that's important for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the race blindness that we talk about in popular feminism, it, is characteristic. Like left movements worldwide have an issue with this, and it has to do with that kind of commitment to capitalism as a kind of singularity, and a tendency to equate colonialism with capitalism, to collapse colonial histories and colonial dynamics into critiques of capitalism. And I don't think that's tenable. It's a real problem to do that. And it faces questions about, the histories of the slave trade, anti-Black racism, and indigenous dispossession and genocide. So these are questions that the left everywhere has struggled, at its best has struggled with, and at its worst has been part of the problem of ignoring and suppressing, in fact. And so we've also seen in self-identified popular feminist initiatives that are grounded in that kind of socialist feminist or anti-capitalist politics, a real kind of inability to grapple with the specificity of discourses around race and racialization that more politicized parts of Black movements lead with. So that if those movements don't lead with a very familiar discourse of anti-capitalism, then they kind of get defined outside the family. And so you have Black movements organizing, you have Black women's movements organizing, where questions about economic marginalization are absolutely central and present because of the dynamics of racialization, but their politics are being advanced in different terms. And I think there's been a kind of tone deafness in many left movements worldwide, to that dynamic. And if you're not willing to kind of decenter your own analytic in order to open your mind and your praxis to how justice and liberation is being advanced in other terms, then you have no capacity to connect, in a reciprocal way with these movements.
Absolutely. And I completely agree. This isn't just a problem in Latin America. This is a problem facing the left across the world. And it's a problem I've encountered quite a bit throughout my time in organizing and doing academic work. Additionally, you identify how work needs to be done around addressing heteronormativity among popular feminism and the popular feminist movements. Can you embellish on this point?
All right. So, but it's a very important point. It's something that we could write like a whole article about. The way I see it is that a big part of the way popular feminist organizations have organized themselves around is around this notion of woman, right? And it's a cisgendered, it's a heteronormative, mostly heteronormative understanding of what woman or women means. And so, like as my own contribution, the title is A Mulher Popular. This is the centerpiece of the way they organize in an identitarian kind of way, right? So there's the trans issue where I've even heard, but I'm thinking that things will slowly change, and there's definitely different parts, different organizations, different groups of people, subgroups that are going to be pushing for these types of policies. It has already happened. Like the younger generation is really pushing for much more attention to heteronormativity and also to the reality of trans women or trans men. And so, but at a certain point, I certainly have heard, arguments that you heard, that are familiar in the sense that some mainstream feminisms in North America, for example, in the 70s, rejected trans women because they haven't experienced the oppression of what women experience because they were raised as men. But in doing so, they kind of ignore the way that trans women, that those individuals, as they were growing up as quote unquote men, suffered because of the way they were not normative, right? And so there's a lot of work to be done there, but it's definitely I think it's something that is already changing. I think there's already some conversations going on, but yeah, that's another important piece.
Yeah, I mean, the best we could do in this issue is to flag it, is to make an observation about the heteronormative character historically and currently of popular feminists, of what is self-identified as popular feminist kinds of politics and analytics. And also, in the racialized and indigenous feminisms that are also part of the issue, they are also, they're silent on questions about sex and gender diversity, right? So we just wanted to flag that. So we think that there is an agenda there to be explored. At the same time, what we wanted to really draw attention to in this issue, which And I don't personally know much or any work really that's scholarly work that has been done on sex and gender diversity in really subalternized populations, and how those issues are appearing and how politics around them are being mobilized. But I will point out that if you're directing people to explore the World March of Women as a practice, it would be really good also to suggest to people in the US especially that the US anchor organization for the World March of Women is an entity called Grassroots Global Justice. And its popular feminism absolutely is intersectional in these terms. It's intersectional around race and gender and sexual diversity in a way that the World March elsewhere is not, that we know of. I would direct people there. And the other thing is to say that, movements like Black Lives Matter are changing the game on this because they are so intersectional in these terms. And they are also so clearly anchored in that kind of race, class, like the articulation between race and class and race and subalternity and also sex and gender diversity. So, I think this is where the leading edge of social movement praxis actually is. And we would love some people to take that up in terms of its relationship to the kinds of things we're talking about in the issue.
Thank you so much for sharing information about that other organization. I will post a link in the show notes so folks can look up more information if they're interested. And I just want to say, like some of these questions are hard, and like you were saying, you just were only able to flag it because this is such a big issue and you're getting into so many other topics already. And I actually think that's one of the beautiful things about your issue is that it just opens a lot of other doors that we need to go through and explore. And I really hope there's a second issue that comes out of this, or potentially an edited volume or something, because I think this is a really important issue. And like you said, a lot of these movements, whether in Latin America or in the United States, Black Lives Matter, these movements with a consciousness of intersectionality are, whether hardcore materialists like it or not, it's the cutting edge. And it's what increasingly young people are becoming attracted to. And it's time that the left starts to bridge the gap between these movements and more traditional historical materialist economic analysis, because that's the future. I really hope to see that in the future. I'm still a young person, but as a formerly young person, college activist, this was always a tension and things that I saw that were really difficult on the left, that if we want to keep making progress in the current moment, considering the rise of right-wing populism and everything else we've seen over the past 5 years, that's the direction we need to go.
Adding just one thing to what you were just saying, that also there is an economic dimension to, obviously, to racial hierarchies, that's very clear to us, but also to LGBTs, hierarchies. That's something that we often completely overlook, but there's a very strong economic dimension to all that. So
yeah, and just on that exact thing is that intersectionality, we always have to guard against important intellectual breakthroughs like that. We have to keep them from getting captured, because the origins of intersectionality were in Black feminism,
right,
where they were explicitly attentive to holding together race, class, and gender in the context of the subalternization of Black people in the US economy. And so it had that very explicit kind of context to it that often gets lost, in contemporary uses of intersectionality that kind of treat it as something that, we just have to do analytically and not be thinking about how it's embedded in those kinds of capitalist and colonial structures that materially structure marginalization.
I really appreciate you bringing that up, because see, look, I was just doing it. I was just falling into the thing that's happening where certain segments of liberal politics have co-opted intersectionality, lacking a class or economic analysis. But if you know anything about the Combahee River Collective and the origins of intersectional Black feminism, it's a very, very left-wing economic critique in that community, in that movement. So absolutely, I appreciate you bringing that up. And I'll probably share more information with listeners about that if they want to find out more about the origins of intersectional and Black feminism in the US. Now, thank you so much. This was so fun. I really hope to have y'all back as guests again, maybe another issue, or just discuss one of your articles, or just if anything, and there's any current events around popular feminism in Latin America. I'd love to have you back to talk to you. This was really fun.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a great conversation.
Yes, thank you. This was fun.
That is all the time we have for today, but thank you for listening in. The July issue of Latin American Perspectives can be accessed at latinamericanperspectives.com or via Sage Publishing. Check the show notes for links to where you can access a copy. And where you can find more information about the World March for Women and Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. If you enjoy the show and would like to receive updates about Latin American news, current events, and content from our journal, please don't forget to follow us on any or all of our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Be sure to listen in to our next episode. Thanks. Goodbye.